Something extraordinary is happening right now, and most people have no idea just how significant it is. While Washington is focused on its next tariff announcement, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has been quietly assembling one of the most ambitious economic alliances in modern history. A coalition so large, so strategically positioned, that it could permanently alter the balance of global trade power. And the White House, by most accounts, did not see it coming. Stay with me, because what I am about to walk you through changes everything you thought you knew about who actually holds the leverage in this trade war. Let us begin with where Carney is right now, because geography matters in this story. As of this morning, March 17, 2026, the Canadian Prime Minister is in Europe. He met today with French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, two of the most consequential leaders on the continent. These are not ceremonial visits. They are not photo opportunities. They are the latest stops in a year-long diplomatic campaign that Carney began almost the moment he was sworn into office. And the scale of what he has been building in that time is nothing short of remarkable. To understand why today matters, you have to go back to where this all started, because this story did not begin in Europe. It began in a moment of crisis on Canadian soil. When Donald Trump re-entered the White House in January 2025, Canada was not prepared for what followed. Tariffs came quickly and without warning, first on steel and aluminum, then on automobiles, then broader duties that touched nearly every sector of the Canadian economy. At the same time, Trump began making remarks that Canadians found not just offensive, but genuinely alarming. He called Canada the 51st state. He referred to Prime Minister Carney not as a prime minister, but as a governor. He suggested in public and repeatedly that Canada's sovereignty was somehow negotiable. For a country that had spent 80 years as one of America's closest allies, it was a fundamental rupture in what both nations had assumed was an unbreakable relationship. But here is what happened next. And this is where the story gets interesting. Rather than simply absorbing the pressure and waiting for Washington to change course, Carney made a decision that most political observers did not fully appreciate at the time. He decided to pivot, not away from the United States entirely, but toward the rest of the world, and to do so with a speed and ambition that had simply never been attempted by a Canadian government before. Within days of taking office, he was on a plane to Paris, then London. By the end of his first year, he had made 26 foreign trips, spending 68 days outside Canada, visiting every continent, and announcing deal after deal after deal. What was Carney actually building during all of those trips? The answer to that question is where things get genuinely consequential. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January of this year, Carney delivered a speech that reverberated around the world. He did not name Donald Trump directly. He did not have to. Speaking to the assembled leaders of global finance and government, he described what he called a rupture in the international rules-based order. He said, and I am paraphrasing carefully here, that great powers had begun using economic integration as a weapon, deploying tariffs as leverage and financial systems as instruments of coercion. He called on the world's middle powers to act together. He warned that if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. It was a precise, deliberate, and strategically loaded message. And within weeks, the world began to respond in ways that Washington clearly had not anticipated. Here is the core of what Carney has been assembling, and this is the part that deserves the most careful attention. According to reporting from Politico, confirmed by Carney himself in a press statement, Canada is actively brokering discussions between two of the world's largest trade blocs. On one side, the European Union, representing 27 member states and roughly $18 trillion in economic output. On the other, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as the CPTPP, a 12-nation Indo-Pacific framework that already accounts for approximately $15.8 trillion in global GDP. Canada holds a unique and structurally significant position in these discussions. It is a member of both. It already has free trade agreements with the European Union through CETA, ratified in 2017, which boosted Canada-EU trade by 65% in 7 years. And it is a founding member of the CPTPP, which covers markets from Japan to Australia to Chile. Carney described Canada's role with unusual clarity. He said, "We are in a somewhat unique position in these discussions where we are part of both, and so we can help broker a bridge between the two." That sentence, understated as it sounds, describes something that has never been attempted at this scale before. If you combine the economic weight of the European Union with the CPTPP framework, the resulting bloc would represent approximately 40% of global GDP, cover nearly 1.5 billion consumers across roughly 40 nations, and span 4 continents. To put that number in perspective, the United States economy represents approximately 25% of global GDP. China sits at around 18 to 20%. What Carney is working toward, if it succeeds, would be larger than either of them individually, and it would do so without the United States at the table. Now, I want to be precise here because intellectual honesty matters in this analysis. This is not a done deal. The discussions are ongoing. The European Union and the CPTPP operate under fundamentally different regulatory frameworks. A full formal merger of the two blocs would face enormous legal and political complexity, and it would not happen quickly. But here is what I have learned over decades of watching international trade negotiations. The fact that the conversation is happening at all is itself a signal. And Washington, whether or not it acknowledges it publicly, has noticed. We know the White House has noticed because of what happened in the days following Carney's Davos speech. Trump responded by saying, and I quote carefully, that Canada lives because of the United States. He revoked Carney's invitation to join his so-called Board of Peace. He threatened Canada with 100% tariffs if Ottawa moved further toward a comprehensive trade deal with Beijing. And he continued to refer to Carney as governor, a deliberate and pointed refusal to acknowledge his status as a democratically elected head of government. These are not the reactions of an administration that is indifferent to what Canada is doing. These are the reactions of an administration that is watching its strategic assumptions about Canada's dependency being actively dismantled and responding with the only tool it has reliably reached for throughout this entire dispute: escalating rhetoric. But rhetoric, as Carney has discovered, is not the same as leverage. Let us talk about what Carney actually secured during this year of travel, because the numbers tell a story that the daily headlines often miss. In Beijing, he announced a Canada-China strategic partnership that cut tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% down to 15% by March of this year, reopening a $4 billion agricultural market. China also agreed to lift discriminatory tariffs on Canadian lobster, peas, canola meal, and crab. In New Delhi, he launched negotiations for a Canada-India economic partnership and secured a landmark uranium supply deal, with Saskatchewan-based Cameco committed to supplying India with 22 million pounds of uranium over 9 years, valued at approximately $2.6 billion. In Sydney, he announced a new economic partnership agreement with Indonesia that would eliminate or reduce tariffs on 95% of Canadian exports once ratified. He also secured participation in Europe's Security Action for Europe program, known as SAFE, which provides up to $244 billion in loans to EU member states for large-scale defense procurement, giving Canadian defense manufacturers direct access to a massive and growing European market. He has set a formal national goal of doubling Canada's non-American exports within the next decade. These are not symbolic gestures. These are legally binding agreements, strategic frameworks, and diversification channels that did not exist 14 months ago. There is one development from this week that deserves particular attention because it speaks directly to Canada's posture toward Washington going forward. Carney said publicly today, on the very morning of his meetings in Europe, that Donald Trump must stop making, in his words, unhelpful and disrespectful comments about Canada becoming the 51st state before any serious bilateral trade conversations can take place. That is an explicit precondition. That is Canada, a country that sends more than 75% of its exports to the United States, setting terms for negotiations rather than simply accepting whatever Washington offers. Whether you agree with that approach or not, it represents a dramatic departure from the pattern of Canadian diplomacy toward the United States that prevailed for most of the last 4 decades. And it is a posture that Carney can sustain precisely because of the economic architecture he has spent the past year constructing. This brings me to what I believe is the most underappreciated dimension of this entire situation, and it is worth staying with for a moment. Canada's leverage in any future negotiation with the United States is directly proportional to the credibility of its alternatives. For most of its modern history, Canada had limited credibility in that regard. The economy was deeply integrated with the American market. The political culture leaned toward accommodation rather than confrontation. And the assumption in Washington was that when push came to shove, Ottawa would always find a way to come to the table on American terms. What Carney has done, deliberately and systematically, is challenge that assumption. Every trade deal signed abroad, every alliance deepened, every bilateral relationship strengthened with a partner other than the United States adds a small but real increment to Canada's negotiating position. And when you add those increments together across 26 foreign trips and agreements spanning 4 continents, the cumulative shift becomes significant. I want to close with an honest assessment of what we do not yet know, because responsible analysis requires it. We do not know whether the EU CPTPP bridge Carney is attempting to build will succeed in any formal or legally binding sense. We do not know how the USMCA review, which Carney himself has described as a robust upcoming negotiation, will unfold once it begins later this year. We do not know whether Trump's posture toward Canada will soften, escalate, or remain at its current level of friction. And we do not know whether Carney's domestic political coalition, currently holding a minority government, will remain stable enough to sustain this ambitious foreign policy agenda over the medium term. All of those are legitimate open questions, and anyone who tells you the outcome is certain is not being straight with you. What we do know is this. 12 months ago, when Mark Carney took office, Canada was in shock. The tariffs had arrived without warning. The sovereignty threats were escalating. The polls showed Canadians frightened and angry, and a Liberal Party that had been trailing the Conservatives by more than 20 points for most of the previous year. Today, Carney is in Europe, meeting with 2 of the most powerful leaders on the continent, having just spent a year constructing a web of trade relationships that spans from Beijing to New Delhi to Sydney to Brussels. He is brokering discussions between 2 blocs that together account for 40% of global output. He is setting preconditions for conversations with Washington rather than simply accepting its terms. And the White House, rather than ignoring him, is responding in ways that make clear he has their attention. Whether all of this ultimately succeeds in protecting Canadian workers, sustaining Canadian sovereignty, and reshaping the global trading architecture in a durable way, that remains to be seen. But the scale of the attempt and the discipline with which it has been executed is something that anyone who watches international politics carefully should be paying very close attention to. Because what Canada is doing right now is not just about Canada. It is a test case for how middle powers respond when the rules of the game change overnight, and when the country that wrote those rules decides it no longer wants to play by them.